The mansion sat on the hill like a monument to silence, tall, flawless, and painfully empty. Every morning the sun rose over its polished windows, but nothing inside ever seemed to wake. No voices, no footsteps, no warmth, just cold perfection guarding a story everyone in town whispered about but never truly knew. Inside, the dining room stretched wider than some people's entire homes. A 14-seat mahogany table ran down the center like a runway of polished wood, the silverware arranged with military precision, the crystal glasses untouched. The chandelier sparkled, but it only lit emptiness. At the very end of the table sat one woman always in the same seat. Evelyn Armitage, the widow whose fortune could buy anything except company. She lifted her fork the same way she had every morning for years, slow, controlled, mechanical. Each bite landed on the plate with a soft clink that echoed through the hollow room. She didn't look left or right. She didn't speak. She didn't breathe deeply. This was her kingdom of silence, and she ruled it alone. The staff moved like shadows along the walls, careful, quiet, avoiding her gaze. They had learned that this dining room was sacred ground, a place where joy was forbidden and conversation was a crime. No one dared disturb the widow's routine. But today, something was different. A faint sound floated from down the hallway, soft at first, almost a mistake. Then again, louder, a bright, bubbling giggle, a child's laugh, so wild, so unfiltered, it sounded like it belonged in another world. The butler froze, the maid gasped. Someone whispered, "Not here, not now." Tiny sneakers pattered against the marble floor, fast, fearless. Before anyone could stop him, a little boy burst through the doorway and skid to a halt beside the dining table, holding half a pancake in his hand and wearing a smile missing one front tooth. Evelyn looked up slowly, her expression unreadable, her fork suspended in midair. The staff waited for the explosion, the order, the firing, something. But the boy simply tilted his head and asked in the most innocent voice imaginable, "Why you always eating alone, lady? That's sad." The room went silent. Evelyn's hand trembled. Something old and buried flickered in her eyes. What the boy didn't know, what nobody knew, was that one innocent question was about to break open a story sealed shut for decades. And what they didn't know would change everything. The mansion came alive only in the ways wealth allowed, lights that turned on automatically, gardeners who trimmed hedges before dawn, housekeepers who polished floors until they reflected back a world that did not truly exist there. But beneath the luxury, beneath the marble and gold and perfect symmetry, the house breathed with a kind of sadness that no one dared speak about. Evelyn Armitage the widow who owned it all, was a woman shaped more by grief than years. Her presence carried weight, the kind that made people stand straighter and speak softer. Her late husband had been a respected businessman, powerful in the city, charitable in the community. Evelyn herself once carried that same warmth. But now, her elegance had become armor. Her staff whispered among themselves. She wasn't always like this. She used to throw big dinners. She laughed once, I remember she used to laugh. But no one mentioned the real wound, the one that turned this home into a tomb of silence. Her only son, gone far too soon, and their relationship broken long before death came between them. Evelyn never spoke of him, never mentioned his name. But she kept his giant portrait hanging directly across from her seat at the dining table, a constant reminder she couldn't bear yet refused to remove. Every morning, she stared at everything except that painting. Marla the nanny, entered this world like an outsider entering a museum, careful, respectful, extremely aware of the invisible boundaries around her. A black woman in her mid-30s, she carried herself with dignity despite the heavy balance of motherhood and long working hours. She had been hired when Evelyn's previous staff rotated out after the husband's passing. Most couldn't handle the emotional ice the widow radiated. Marla, though, had a quiet strength about her. She did her job with precision, never stepping where she wasn't invited. Her rule was simple. Stay small, stay invisible, don't attract the widow's displeasure. But Marla had something that didn't fit the mansion's cold walls. A 6-year-old son named Jaden a spark of joy in human form. Jaden was the kind of child who saw possibility in every hallway, adventure in every staircase, and questions in everything adults tried to hide. Because of Marla's long hours, he often came with her to work, staying in the staff wing of the mansion. A tiny room with faded wallpaper and a small window was his castle, as he called it. The mansion had a strict rule. Jaden was not allowed in the main house. Not because Evelyn hated children, but because their noise, their unpredictability, their warmth, reminded her too much of what she had lost. Marla reminded him daily. You stay close to me, you stay quiet. This house ain't like ours, understand? Jaden nodded most days, and disobeyed on others, not out of disrespect, but because curiosity led him in ways Marla couldn't always catch. He sensed something about Evelyn, the way she moved, the way she avoided emotion. Why does the rich lady look so sad all the time? He asked once. Marla hushed him quickly. Baby, some people carry storms inside them, and you don't walk straight into a storm. But Jaden didn't understand storms that didn't make sound. Staff rarely spoke to Evelyn unless spoken to. Even the wealthiest families in the city respected her space. Rumors spread about her temper, her grief, her unpredictability. Some said she fired a maid once for humming a song too loudly. Others said she dismissed a gardener because he laughed while working. Maybe the stories were exaggerated, maybe not. But the result was the same. Everyone kept their distance. Marla felt the pressure more than most. Being a single mother in a wealthy environment meant she was always one mistake away from losing her job, the one thing standing between stability and struggle. She watched her son closely, making sure he never disrupted the fragile order of the mansion. Still deep down, she knew something Evelyn never would have admitted. The house needed Jaden as much as Jaden needed safety. Because despite her silence, Evelyn noticed the child. The first time she heard his laugh echo through the staff hallway, she stiffened like someone had pressed a bruise. Not because she was annoyed, but because the sound dragged up memories she had buried so deep she pretended they never existed. Her son, years ago, had laughed that same way. Wild, pure. Until life hardened him. Until she hardened him. Whenever Jaden's small sneakers squeaked against the floor, Evelyn paused mid-step, as if listening to something she didn't know she missed. Her doctor visited occasionally, urging her toward human connection. You're isolating yourself too much, he warned. You need company, companionship. Evelyn dismissed him with a cold smile. People are unreliable, silence is. But her hands trembled when she said it. That crack, that tremor, was the first sign that the fortress she'd built was weakening. Meanwhile, Jaden kept pushing invisible boundaries. Peeking around corners. Asking questions. Drawing pictures of people sitting together at long tables. Wondering why anyone would choose to be alone when they had so many chairs. He didn't understand wealth, status, or emotional walls. He only saw a lonely woman living in a giant house that didn't feel like a home. And the truth was simple. One day, he was going to cross the line that had kept Evelyn's world frozen in place. Not out of rebellion, but because some souls are born to melt the cold. What none of them knew, not Evelyn, not Marla, not the staff, was that the connection between a grieving widow and a fearless child was about to transform everything this mansion had come to represent. And once the walls started cracking, there would be no way to stop what came next. The morning after Jaden wandered into the forbidden dining room, the mansion buzzed with the kind of tension that made every breath feel borrowed. The staff whispered in corners, trading nervous glances, preparing themselves for whatever consequences might fall from the widow's silence. No one had expected her to react as she did. Or rather, as she didn't. Evelyn hadn't raised her voice. Hadn't called for the butler. Hadn't dismissed Marla on the spot. She simply stared at the child with an expression no one could decode. A mix of shock, recognition, and a heaviness she couldn't hide even behind her practiced coldness. Now, with the memory of that moment still lingering like dust in sunlight, Marla walked down the long hallway with her shoulders drawn tight. She replayed the scene again and again, bracing herself for the conversation she dreaded. She expected a letter, a warning, a termination notice, something. But instead, there was only silence. Silence from the woman who used silence as her language. Marla stepped into the small staff kitchen and found Jaden sitting at the table with crayons scattered around him. His small face lit up the moment he saw her. "Mama, I drew something. Look." Her heart squeezed. Part of her wanted to smile back. The other part remembered the look on Evelyn's face, the way her eyes had flickered, as if someone opened a window she long ago sealed shut. "Baby," she said gently, trying to steady herself, "what you did yesterday running into that dining room." "I was just looking," he shrugged innocently. She looked lonely. Marla knelt beside him. "That's not our business, sweetheart. This house got rules for a reason." Jaden frowned in confusion. "It's a big table, Mama. Why she sit all by herself?" "Because she's lost people she loved. Because she doesn't know how to let anyone close anymore. Because your laughter poked a hole in a wound she never healed." Marla swallowed the words she couldn't say out loud. "Some people don't want company. That's why we stay in our place." Before Jaden could respond, the kitchen door opened quietly. The head butler, Mr. Langston, stood in the doorway. His posture was as stiff as the ironed crease in his suit pants, but his eyes were softer than usual, which frightened Marla more than anger would have. "Mrs. Armitage would like to see you," he said. Marla froze. "Me?" He nodded. "Both of you." Jaden perked up. "Really? Can I show her my drawing?" Marla's stomach twisted. She stood slowly, wiping her hands on her apron to hide the slight shake. "Where does she want us?" "She's in the conservatory." The conservatory. A space of glass and light where she never held meetings with staff. A place filled with plants she rarely touched, but refused to remove. A room that used to be her safe space, back when her family was still whole. Every step toward that room felt like walking toward a verdict. The glass doors were already open. Sunlight poured in across the marble floor, warming the air in a gentle way the mansion rarely allowed. Evelyn stood near the tall window, her back to them, hands clasped neatly in front of her. The light made her appear almost ghost-like, wrapped in a halo she didn't seem aware of. Marla cleared her throat softly. "Ma'am, you asked for us." Evelyn didn't turn immediately. When she did, her expression was unreadable but much softer than Marla prepared herself for. Her eyes drifted down to Jaden first, not with anger, not with annoyance, more like someone trying to understand something unexpected. "You," she said quietly to him, "you're the boy who walked into my dining room." Jaden nodded with complete confidence. "I wasn't trying to be bad. I just didn't like seeing you eatin' all by yourself." Marla inhaled sharply. "Jaden." But Evelyn raised a hand gently. "It's all right." The words were so foreign, so unfamiliar coming from her, that even the plants in the room seemed surprised. Evelyn studied Jaden for a long moment. "You said eating alone looked sad." "Yeah," he replied simply, like it was obvious. "Food tastes better with people." For the first time in years, maybe decades, a ghost of a smile flickered at the corner of Evelyn's lips. It didn't fully form, but its presence alone was enough to make Marla's breath catch. "Who taught you that?" Evelyn asked. "My mama," Jaden said proudly. "She says we eat together every night, even if we tired, even if food not fancy." Evelyn glanced at Marla, her expression complicated. "Is that so?" Marla nodded awkwardly. "It's just a thing we do, keeps us close." Evelyn's gaze dropped to Jaden's crayon-filled hands. "And what do you have there?" Jaden lifted his paper, a drawing of a long table with many seats, all filled, people smiling, a child in the center laughing. One empty seat at the end. "That one's yours," Jaden said softly. Silence folded over the room like a blanket, not heavy, but warm, unfamiliar. Evelyn looked at the picture with an expression that broke something fragile inside her. Memories flickered behind her eyes, her son sitting at a table years ago, legs swinging, laughter echoing louder than the clinks of silverware. She blinked once, as if forcing the memory back into place. "Thank you," she whispered. Jaden beamed. Marla felt something shift in the room, a subtle crack in a wall she always assumed was unbreakable. Evelyn inhaled slowly, gathering herself. "Marla, I need to speak with you, privately." Jaden stepped behind his mother's leg. Marla's heart pounded. "Jaden, baby, go with Mr. Langston for a moment," she said. "I'll be right there." The butler led the child out, leaving the two women alone in the sunlit room. Evelyn faced her fully now. "I assume you're expecting me to fire you." Marla clenched her jaw. If that's what you feel is right, ma'am. It isn't, Evelyn said quietly. Marla blinked. I'm not accustomed to being interrupted, Evelyn continued. And certainly not by a child, but yesterday, her voice wavered slightly. Yesterday something felt different. Marla waited, remaining still. That boy, Evelyn said, almost to herself, walked into a room where no one has spoken to me in years, and instead of apologizing or shrinking, he told me the truth. Marla didn't know whether to apologize or stand taller. Evelyn's eyes softened with something raw and unguarded. Your son reminded me of someone I failed a long time ago. Marla swallowed. I'm sorry for whatever pain that brought back. It didn't bring it back, Evelyn whispered. It revealed that it never left. The words sank like stones into water. Evelyn exhaled deeply. I want him kept away from the main dining room, for now, but I don't want him silenced. Marla blinked in shock. Ma'am. I'm asking you, Evelyn said slowly, not to keep him so hidden. He's a child. He shouldn't move like a shadow. It was the closest thing to kindness Marla had ever heard from her. But then Evelyn's voice dropped lower, more vulnerable. There's something else. Marla steadied herself. Yes, ma'am. I would like you to bring him to the conservatory again tomorrow morning. She hesitated. With breakfast. The request landed like a pebble dropped into a still pond, small, but the ripples reached every corner of Marla's chest. She nodded slowly. If that's what you want. It is, Evelyn said, though her voice wasn't entirely steady. For the first time, Marla saw it, the loneliness hiding inside this woman's elegant shell. A deep, unspoken ache that had shaped every cold decision she ever made. As Evelyn turned back to the window, sunlight casting her silhouette in warm gold, Marla realized something profound. This wasn't the beginning of trouble. It was the beginning of change. A change neither of them was fully prepared for. The house felt different the next morning, as if someone had secretly cracked open a window after years of stale air. But Evelyn refused to acknowledge it. She sat at the far end of the dining table as always, the untouched breakfast cooling under the chandelier. Across from her, the chair where her late husband once sat remained empty, a hollow reminder she never let anyone shift or dust. Maria walked in quietly, placing a fresh vase of flowers on the sideboard. She knew better than to disturb the silence, but she also sensed something shifting in the atmosphere. Maybe it was the faint echo of the boys' laughter from yesterday still floating in the walls. Maybe it was the way Evelyn's eyes had lingered for a fraction of a second longer when she saw Elijah holding that broken toy. A look not of annoyance, but recognition. Maria tried to act normal, but Evelyn suddenly spoke, her voice unexpectedly soft. Your son, she whispered, not looking up, does he always behave like that? Maria stiffened, unsure if it was criticism or curiosity. He's a good boy, ma'am. He just sees the world differently. Everything feels big and exciting to him. Evelyn didn't respond. She simply lifted her teacup, hands trembling ever so slightly. Maria gently nodded and stepped out of the room, leaving the widow alone with a silence she no longer found comforting. In the living room, Elijah sat on the rug, building a little house from leftover cardboard. When Maria asked what he was doing, he grinned his wide, gap-toothed grin. Making a home that doesn't feel sad, he said innocently. Every house needs laughter, otherwise it gets sick. His words stabbed softly into Maria's heart. She knew he didn't understand grief or wealth or loneliness, but somehow he understood people in ways grown adults forgot. Later that afternoon, while Maria cleaned upstairs, Elijah wandered again. He wasn't being disobedient. He was just curious, drawn to spaces that whispered stories. He ended up near the large study door, slightly cracked open. Inside, Evelyn stood by a desk full of unopened mail and dusty picture frames, her fingers hovering over a photograph of her late husband. She quickly shut the drawer when she heard the creak. Elijah peeked in with wide eyes. Are you sad again? He asked softly. Evelyn blinked. No one had dared ask her something so direct in years. She opened her mouth, but no words came. She wasn't used to being seen, much less understood. The boy stepped inside timidly. Can I show you something? It's not loud, promise. She should have told him to leave. She should have called Maria. But instead, she simply nodded, a tiny surrender she didn't fully understand. Elijah opened his little cardboard house and pulled out two stick-figure drawings. One was him and his mother, smiling. The other was a faceless woman standing alone in a big room. "This is you," he said with gentle honesty, "but it doesn't have to stay like that." The words cracked through her defenses. Evelyn felt her breath hitch. A child had just mirrored the emptiness she'd been drowning in for years without ever speaking it aloud. She tried to straighten, pretend the comment meant nothing, but her throat tightened. "Why would you draw me alone?" He shrugged simply. "Because you look lonely, but people get better when someone sits with them. Mama says laughter is medicine." He paused. "I could give you some." The innocence in his offer disarmed her more than any sympathy from adults ever could. But before she could respond, Maria appeared at the door, alarm in her eyes. "Elijah, you can't just—" Evelyn lifted one hand, stopping her, a gesture she rarely used. "It's all right," she whispered. Maria froze, stunned. Elijah beamed. But Evelyn, overwhelmed by emotions she hadn't planned to feel, stepped back. The photograph of her husband still lay half-hidden on the desk, its frame dusty with years of untouched grief. Elijah noticed it. "Was he your special person?" he asked gently. The question hit her harder than she expected. She clenched her jaw, turning away. "Please go downstairs." Elijah obeyed, but not before softly placing one of his drawings, the smiling one, on her desk. When he left, Evelyn stared at the bright, childish colors contrasting against her cold, lifeless study. For the rest of the day, she avoided both Maria and Elijah, burying herself in the quiet rooms of the house. But every corner she passed, the hallway he laughed in, the couch cushions he jumped on, the kitchen stool he danced on, held echoes of the life she'd tried so hard to shut out. Night arrived heavy and restless. Evelyn walked into the dining room, expecting the usual stillness. But this time, she hesitated before sitting at the far end. She looked at the empty chair opposite her, the one she had protected like a glass shrine. Then, with a trembling breath, she moved one seat closer. Just one. Meanwhile, Maria tucked Elijah into bed in the small attic room the estate assigned her. But before sleeping, the boy whispered, "Mama, I think the lady is hurting, not the mean kind of hurting, the quiet one that makes rooms feel cold." Maria stroked his hair, knowing he wasn't wrong. Downstairs, Evelyn stared at the untouched dinner in front of her, her chest tight. She didn't know why the little boy's presence had shaken something loose. She didn't know why his laughter lingered in her ears like a forgotten song. But she did know one thing. For the first time in years, she wasn't fully alone. And that terrified her more than the loneliness ever had. The next morning, Evelyn found herself waking earlier than usual. She lay still for a moment, feeling the unfamiliar weight of something she couldn't name. A lingering echo of a small voice saying, "I could give you some laughter." It bothered her how much that sentence replayed in her mind. She tried to shake it off, dressing with her usual precision. But when she descended the stairs, she paused halfway, hearing faint whispers from the kitchen. Elijah's tiny voice floated through the air, excited and earnest. "Mama, do rich people eat pancakes, or only fancy stuff?" Maria hushed him, but the soft clatter of plates continued. Evelyn lingered on the stairs longer than she should have, listening. It wasn't the words, it was the warmth, something her home hadn't held in years. She entered the dining room expecting emptiness, but instead found a small surprise. A plate with pancakes topped with a single strawberry sitting off to the side of the table. Not for her, she never ate such things, but for someone, somewhere. Then she heard it, little footsteps charging toward her. Elijah skidded to a stop at the doorway. "Good morning, Miss Evelyn," he shouted, too loud for her quiet world. His little face was smeared with flour. "I tried to make pancakes, but Mama said I can't use the stove, so I did the decorating." Evelyn blinked at him, the corners of her mouth threatening to soften. "I see," she said quietly. He nodded proudly, holding up a sticky spatula like a trophy. "It's a smiley, see?" He pointed at the pancakes arranged into a face. "Because people should see a smile in the morning." She didn't know what to say. She didn't remember the last time anyone made anything for her with intention. Everything in her house was delivered, prepared, arranged, but nothing was made for her. Maria entered behind him, flustered. "I'm sorry, ma'am." He woke early and insisted on helping. Evelyn lifted a hand. "It's fine." Maria stared, surprised again. Evelyn herself didn't understand why she said it. As she sat down, Elijah sat cross-legged on the floor near the doorway, humming to himself, building something out of napkins and sugar packets. The widow found her eyes drifting toward him, watching as he folded the packets into rough shapes, then balanced them in a tiny tower. "What are you making?" she finally asked. He looked up, grinning. "A table that doesn't feel empty." The words punched the air out of her chest. She swallowed hard, glancing toward the enormous dining table, 24 seats, always filled with silence. "You know," Elijah added innocently, "you don't have to eat alone. My mama says eating alone feels like your heart sits in the empty chair." Maria gasped, "Elijah, enough." But Evelyn didn't scold him. Something in his honesty had pierced a place she avoided. The day continued with subtle shifts. Small, nearly invisible moments that only mattered because for years her world had been a flat line, and suddenly tiny beats of life began pushing against the silence. While Maria cleaned the sitting room, Evelyn passed by and saw Elijah quietly arranging her late husband's books by height. She almost snapped at him. Those shelves had not been touched in years, but he was humming softly, tracing each cover with a kind of gentle reverence. Almost respect. When he noticed her, he didn't flinch. "These books are lonely," he said softly. "Someone should hold them sometimes." She didn't understand why her throat tightened. Later in the afternoon, Evelyn retreated to her study again. She tried to read old financial documents to distract herself, but her eyes kept wandering to the little drawing Elijah had left on her desk. The paper glowed with childish happiness, a smiling woman with bright colors and open arms. Something inside her chest ached at the idea of being drawn that way, as if someone saw her differently from the woman she had been forced to become after grief consumed her. The house felt heavier and lighter at the same time, a strange combination. In the hallway, she found Maria kneeling beside Elijah, trying to calm him as he cried softly. Evelyn froze, hidden by the corner. "I didn't mean to break it," Elijah sniffled, holding his small hands close to his chest. "I just wanted the house to have music. I didn't know it was special." Maria wrapped him in her arms. "It's okay, baby. Accidents happen." Evelyn stepped forward, revealing herself. On the floor lay a shattered music box, her husband's, the one she hadn't wound since the day he died. Maria looked terrified. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry, he didn't." But Evelyn didn't look at her. Her eyes were locked on the little boy, tears streaking down his cheeks, his small body trembling like he expected the world to collapse around him. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then Evelyn knelt. The motion alone shocked Maria. She had never seen the widow lower herself before anyone. Evelyn gently picked up a small brass gear from the broken box. "This music," she said quietly, almost whispering to herself, "hasn't played in years." She looked at Elijah. "Why did you try to wind it?" He sniffled, "Because the house felt sad and music helps things breathe." Something inside her cracked open. She nodded slowly. "It does." Maria's eyes widened. Evelyn almost never admitted anything that personal. The widow stood and took a deep, steady breath. "Maria, take him to wash up. I'll see what can be repaired." It was the first time in years she acknowledged anything broken with hope instead of dismissal. That evening, something unexpected happened. As Evelyn walked past the dining room on her way upstairs, she heard muffled giggling. She peeked inside. Elijah was sitting under the dining table, her grand, intimidating, polished wood dining table, pretending it was a fort. He waved a napkin like a little flag. When he saw her, instead of scrambling away in fear, he waved her over. "Do you want to see my castle?" A castle, under a table that had only ever held emptiness. She hesitated. Then, to her own shock, she lowered herself and peeked under the table edge. Inside, the legs of the table looked like wooden pillars supporting a secret kingdom. Elijah had placed tiny sugar packet people around the base, each one with a hand-drawn smile. "This is Queen Evelyn," he explained, holding one up proudly. "She used to be sad, but she has people now." She stared at the tiny packet, her heart squeezing painfully. "No," she whispered, "I don't." Elijah shook his head with childlike certainty. "Yes, you do. You have us." It was the first time anyone had spoken to her with such warmth in years. And it wasn't pity. It wasn't politeness. It was just truth. She crawled back out quickly, overwhelmed, her eyes stinging. She blamed the dust, or the angle, or anything except the possibility that she felt something real. She went to bed early that night, but sleep refused to come. The boy's words looped through her mind. The simple, innocent faith he had that nothing and no one had to stay lonely. For the first time since her husband died, she wondered what it would feel like to sit at the dining table with someone else, to hear chatter instead of the hum of a refrigerator, to watch a child swing their legs while eating pancakes. The thought scared her, but it also warmed something frozen deep inside her. Before dawn, she found herself walking toward the dining room again, just to look at it, to imagine the impossible. The chairs seemed less like monuments and more like invitations. And though she didn't say it out loud, the truth echoed quietly inside her chest. Maybe the boy wasn't wrong. Maybe she didn't have to stay alone anymore. The following day brought a soft drizzle, the kind that made the world feel slower and quieter. Evelyn stood by the tall windows, watching raindrops race each other down the glass. Normally, she loved days like this, days where the world outside seemed to retreat and leave her alone with her silence. But today, that silence felt heavier. Somewhere down the hall, she heard Elijah's voice again. Light, curious, unbothered by the weather. It filtered through the mansion like sunlight slipping in through broken shutters. He was humming. Not the tune from the music box. That one was lost to time and broken gears, but something else, something simple and hopeful. She found herself listening longer than she meant to, her fingers frozen on the window latch. Maria's voice followed, calm and patient as she guided him through folding laundry. No, baby, shirts go this way, not sideways. Elijah laughed, insisting his sideways method looked like sleeping shirts. Evelyn turned away, unsettled by how comforting the sound was. Later, when she entered the hallway, she found Elijah dragging a heavy blanket across the floor. He struggled with it, his tiny feet sliding as he tried to pull it toward the dining room. "What are you doing?" Evelyn asked, trying to mask the faint amusement forming in her voice. Elijah stopped, startled but not scared. "Building something," he said proudly. "You'll see, it's a surprise." Maria ran up behind him out of breath. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, It's fine," Evelyn said again. "Let him." Maria blinked, almost confused by how easily the widow allowed this new chaos. Elijah tugged the blanket through the dining room doorway, and Evelyn followed out of curiosity, staying hidden behind the frame. Inside, he carefully draped the blanket across 2 chairs, creating a kind of canopy. Then he placed his tiny cardboard house beneath it, tucking it in as though it could feel the cold. "It needs shelter," he murmured. "Everyone does." Evelyn felt something twist in her chest. For a moment, she imagined a different version of her life, one where her own dining room wasn't a hollow shrine to absence, but a place where laughter could take shelter too. That single thought frightened her so much she stepped backward, bumping the doorframe. Elijah looked up and beamed. "Do you like it?" She hesitated. "It's very creative." His face lit up, as if she'd given him a trophy. He lifted the blanket flap wide. "You can come inside if you want. My castle has room." She froze. Her instinct was to say no, to retreat, to protect the fragile walls around her grief. But for a moment, just a tiny one, she imagined what it would feel like to sit under that blanket fort with a child who saw her as something other than a lonely shadow drifting through hallways. Her lips parted, ready to speak. But the doorbell rang. The sharp sound cut through the moment like a blade. Elijah's shoulders slumped. "Oh, I think it's someone fancy." Maria hurried to answer it. Evelyn followed with measured steps, returning to her posture of control, though her heart was still somewhere beneath that blanket fort. At the front door stood Mr. Langford, Evelyn's late husband's former business partner. A tall, polished man with a smile that never reached his eyes. He carried a leather briefcase and arrogance like cologne. "Evelyn," he greeted stiffly. "Still living alone in this museum, I see." She stiffened. "What do you want, Harold?" He stepped inside without waiting for permission, glancing around with thinly veiled judgment. His gaze stopped when he saw Elijah peeking from behind the staircase railings. "And who is this?" Langford asked, his voice sharpening. Maria stepped protectively in front of her son. "He's my child, sir." Langford scoffed. "You allow the help to bring their children into your house," he said to Evelyn, as though she were incapable of managing her own estate. Evelyn opened her mouth to defend, to explain. She didn't know, but no words came. Elijah quietly slipped behind Maria's leg, intimidated by the stranger's coldness. Langford wasn't done. "This is exactly why the board worries about you," he said in a low voice. You've let your standards go, letting staff clutter your home with noise. Noise. The word hit Evelyn harder than it should have, because for the first time in years, noise was exactly what she had begun to crave. Langford continued, You need to maintain order, appearances. This is no place for children running around like it's a park. Maria looked down, her cheeks burning with humiliation. Elijah clung to her legs, silent now. Evelyn felt a burning sensation rise in her chest, anger, defense, something protective. But she swallowed it, conditioned by years of letting Harold dictate what was proper. I'll handle it, she murmured, her voice thin. Elijah's little face fell. A small crack of hurt crossed his features, invisible to everyone but Evelyn. She felt it like a weight. Langford smirked, satisfied. He walked with her to the study to discuss old property matters, but Evelyn couldn't focus. His voice droned on, lecturing and patronizing, but all she could see was the look Elijah had given her. The look of someone who believed in her kindness and watched it bend under pressure. The meeting ended and Langford left. His criticism lingered like smoke. Evelyn walked into the hallway, expecting silence. Instead, she found Elijah crouched in front of the broken music box pieces she had moved to a side table. He wasn't touching them, just looking at them, his little brow furrowed. He didn't notice her at first. Then, in the softest whisper, he said to himself, Maybe she doesn't want laughter after all. The sentence was so small, so quiet, yet it pierced deeper than any words Harold Langford had ever thrown her way. Evelyn took a shaky breath. Elijah, she said gently. He looked up quickly, trying to hide whatever he was feeling with a smile. Sorry, I wasn't messing with it. She shook her head. No, it's all right. He stood slowly, unsure of her mood. I didn't mean to make trouble. You didn't, she said. He hesitated, then asked the question with heartbreaking innocence. Am I noise? The world seemed to freeze. Evelyn looked at him, this small child who brought life into the coldest corners of her world, and saw how deeply Langford's words had cut. And for the first time in a very long time, her voice broke. No, she whispered, you're not noise, you remind the house it's still alive. Elijah blinked, surprised. Maria, who had been silently approaching, froze when she heard those words. She had never heard her employer say anything so human. Evelyn's eyes drifted to the dining room, still half covered by Elijah's blanket fort. The little cardboard house sat beneath it, waiting, hoping. Maybe she was tired of shrinking around her grief. Maybe she was tired of letting men like Harold dictate what her life should look like. Or maybe she was simply ready to breathe again, even if she didn't fully understand how. But for the first time, she wanted to choose something different. Elijah tugged gently on her sleeve. Do you want to finish seeing my castle? Her throat tightened. Yes, she whispered, I think I do. And together they walked toward the dining room, the room that had once been the coldest part of her life, now slowly warming with a child's hope. The blanket fort waited, and so did everything she'd been afraid to feel. Evelyn stepped into the dining room slowly, almost cautiously, as if she were entering a sacred place she wasn't sure she deserved. The blanket fort Elijah built still stood, a little crooked from his earlier attempts to make the castle warm. One chair held the blanket high, the other sagged slightly, creating a soft, cave-like entrance. Elijah darted ahead of her, lifting the edge of the blanket like a curtain. You can come in, he whispered, as if the castle had rules and he was its guardian. Evelyn blinked at the small invitation. In a house built on rigid etiquette and cold expectations, this little gesture felt enormous. She lowered herself slowly, carefully, folding her long frame under the blanket until she sat cross-legged on the floor. The smell of old wood mixed with the faint flower scent from Elijah's morning adventures. Under the table, the world felt smaller, closer, warmer, as if the outside sorrows couldn't reach her here. Elijah settled opposite her, proudly showing off the sugar packet people he'd created. This is Queen Evelyn, he said again, handing her the one with bright marker smiles. She's part of the castle now. Part of the castle, not above it, not feared within it, not worshipped at a distance, just included. Evelyn held the tiny packet like it was made of glass. A strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest, but before she could speak, the dining room door swung open sharply. Harold Langford stood there. He froze at the sight before him. The powerful, untouchable widow crouched on the floor under a blanket fort, sitting cross-legged beside a child he clearly deemed unworthy of her presence. The shock on his face didn't last long. It twisted into disgust. "What on earth is happening here?" Langford barked, stepping closer. "Evelyn, get out from under there. This is humiliating." Elijah flinched. Evelyn stiffened. Langford reached forward, grabbing the blanket and yanking it off the chairs. The structure collapsed instantly, blankets falling over Elijah and Evelyn like a wave. Elijah yelped as the chair legs scraped loudly against the floor. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Maria rushed to the doorway, her face draining of color. "Sir, please." Langford threw a hand up. "Enough, this is not a playground. This is Evelyn Armitage's home, a place of stature, not," he gestured at Elijah harshly, "mess." Evelyn slowly stood, pulling the blanket off herself and the terrified boy. Elijah's little hands were shaking. His sugar packet villagers were crushed beneath Langford's polished shoes. Her pulse hammered. She tried to speak, but Langford pushed on. "This ends now. I warned you the board was questioning your judgment, and here you are crawling under tables with children of the staff. Evelyn, you can't afford these lapses." Evelyn felt the old instinct rising inside her, the instinct to shrink, to yield, to let Harold steer her life, because she had been too broken to resist after her husband died. But then she saw Elijah's face. Tears clung to his lashes, but he was forcing himself not to cry. He looked at her the same way he had when the music box broke, afraid he had done something wrong. Afraid he was wrong. Something inside Evelyn snapped. Not in anger. In awakening. She stepped forward, placing a steady hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You didn't have the right to touch that fort," she said quietly to Langford. He blinked. "Excuse me." "You heard me." Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it, the kind no one had heard from her in years. Langford scoffed. "Evelyn, you're confused, you're grieving, and you're letting this child cloud your reason." Her jaw tightened. "Do not speak about him that way." Maria stared, wide-eyed. Elijah looked up at Evelyn as though she were becoming someone new right before him. Langford stepped closer, voice dripping with condescension. "You need to get your house in order. That boy does not belong here, and neither does this softness." Elijah trembled. Evelyn felt his tiny hand clutch the fabric of her sleeve. And that was the moment everything inside her aligned. Grief, memory, loneliness, and the unexpected warmth a child had brought into her frozen life. "No," she said softly, "you're the one who doesn't belong here anymore." Langford's face darkened. "What nonsense is this? I've advised this family for 20. And you've controlled it for just as long," she cut in. Her voice was steady now. "For years you told me how to live, what my home should look like, how a widow should behave. You sold properties my husband would have kept. You silenced anyone who tried to reach me, and I let you, because I was broken and you knew it." Langford stiffened, caught off guard by the clarity in her words. "But this house is mine," she continued. "My life is mine, and this child," she placed a protective hand over Elijah's small back, "is the first real joy this dining room has seen in decades." Langford scoffed. "It's embarrassing. You look pathetic playing with a child under a table." For the first time in years, Evelyn didn't shrink. She stepped forward, face unflinching. "Playing with a child is not pathetic, but belittling innocence, that is." Silence filled the room, heavy, electric. Maria clutched Elijah closer, eyes glistening. Langford tried one last strike. "If you continue like this, the company board will remove you. They'll take everything your husband left you." Evelyn exhaled slowly. "If they don't want a CEO with a heart, then they can have my resignation." Langford froze. "You wouldn't." "I just did." The words echoed, final and freeing. Years of oppression lifted off her shoulders in a single breath. Langford's face turned an ugly shade of red. He grabbed his briefcase, sputtering. "You're making a grave mistake, Evelyn." "Get out," she said simply. He glared at Elijah on his way out, but the boy didn't hide. He stood straighter, clinging to Evelyn's sleeve, protected. The door slammed behind Langford. Silence filled the dining room again, but this time it wasn't cold. It was warm, alive, a silence made of possibility. Evelyn finally dropped to one knee beside Elijah. "Are you all right?" He nodded, but tears spilled anyway. "I didn't want to get you in trouble." Her heart squeezed. "You didn't, you helped me." Maria couldn't hold back her tears. "Ma'am, I don't know what to say." Evelyn reached for Elijah's sugar packet villagers and gently brushed the crushed pieces into her hand. "We can rebuild the castle," she said softly. "Better this time." Elijah wiped his face, sniffling. "Really? Really?" He threw his arms around her neck, surprising her with the force of his tiny hug. For a moment she froze, unused to being held. Then slowly, hesitantly, she embraced him back. The dining room, once a monument to emptiness, felt full. Not of people, not of wealth, but of something far rarer. Healing. Evelyn looked around the room, imagining what it could become, what it should have been all along. A place where no one ate alone. A place where laughter didn't feel forbidden. A place where a widow found the courage to become more than the ghost she had been living as. Elijah pulled back and whispered, "Does this mean I can help build the new castle?" Evelyn smiled, really smiled, for the first time in years. "It means," she said, brushing his hair gently, "this castle belongs to us." Evelyn stepped into the dining room slowly, almost cautiously, as if she were entering a sacred place she wasn't sure she deserved. The blanket fort Elijah built still stood, a little crooked from his earlier attempts to make the castle warm. One chair held the blanket high, the other sagged slightly, creating a soft, cave-like entrance. Elijah darted ahead of her, lifting the edge of the blanket like a curtain. "You can come in," he whispered, as if the castle had rules and he was its guardian. Evelyn blinked at the small invitation. In a house built on rigid etiquette and cold expectations, this little gesture felt enormous. She lowered herself slowly, carefully, folding her long frame under the blanket until she sat cross-legged on the floor. The smell of old wood mixed with the faint flower scent from Elijah's morning adventures. Under the table, the world felt smaller, closer, warmer, as if the outside sorrows couldn't reach her here. Elijah settled opposite her, proudly showing off the sugar packet people he'd created. "This is Queen Evelyn," he said again, handing her the one with bright marker smiles. "She's part of the castle now." Part of the castle, not above it, not feared within it, not worshipped at a distance, just included. Evelyn held the tiny packet like it was made of glass. A strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest, but before she could speak, the dining room door swung open sharply. Harold Langford stood there. He froze at the sight before him. The powerful, untouchable widow crouched on the floor under a blanket fort, sitting cross-legged beside a child he clearly deemed unworthy of her presence. The shock on his face didn't last long. It twisted into disgust. "What on earth is happening here?" Langford barked, stepping closer. "Evelyn, get out from under there. This is humiliating." Elijah flinched. Evelyn stiffened. Langford reached forward, grabbing the blanket and yanking it off the chairs. The structure collapsed instantly, blankets falling over Elijah and Evelyn like a wave. Elijah yelped as the chair legs scraped loudly against the floor. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Maria rushed to the doorway, her face draining of color. "Sir, please." Langford threw a hand up. "Enough, this is not a playground. This is Evelyn Armitage's home, a place of stature, not," he gestured at Elijah harshly, "mess." Evelyn slowly stood, pulling the blanket off herself and the terrified boy. Elijah's little hands were shaking. His sugar packet villagers were crushed beneath Langford's polished shoes. Her pulse hammered. She tried to speak, but Langford pushed on. "This ends now. I warned you the board was questioning your judgment, and here you are crawling under tables with children of the staff. Evelyn, you can't afford these lapses." Evelyn felt the old instinct rising inside her, the instinct to shrink, to yield, to let Harold steer her life, because she had been too broken to resist after her husband died. But then she saw Elijah's face. Tears clung to his lashes, but he was forcing himself not to cry. He looked at her the same way he had when the music box broke, afraid he had done something wrong, afraid he was wrong. Something inside Evelyn snapped. Not in anger, in awakening. She stepped forward, placing a steady hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You didn't have the right to touch that fort," she said quietly to Langford. He blinked. "Excuse me." You heard me. Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it, the kind no one had heard from her in years. Langford scoffed. Evelyn, you're confused, you're grieving, and you're letting this child cloud your reason. Her jaw tightened. Do not speak about him that way. Maria stared, wide-eyed. Elijah looked up at Evelyn as though she were becoming someone new right before him. Langford stepped closer, voice dripping with condescension. You need to get your house in order. That boy does not belong here, and neither does this softness. Elijah trembled. Evelyn felt his tiny hand clutch the fabric of her sleeve. And that was the moment everything inside her aligned. Grief, memory, loneliness, and the unexpected warmth a child had brought into her frozen life. No, she said softly, you're the one who doesn't belong here anymore. Langford's face darkened. What nonsense is this? I've advised this family for 20. And you've controlled it for just as long, she cut in. Her voice was steady now. For years you told me how to live, what my home should look like, how a widow should behave. You sold properties my husband would have kept. You silenced anyone who tried to reach me, and I let you, because I was broken and you knew it. Langford stiffened, caught off guard by the clarity in her words. But this house is mine, she continued. My life is mine, and this child, she placed a protective hand over Elijah's small back, is the first real joy this dining room has seen in decades. Langford scoffed. It's embarrassing. You look pathetic playing with a child under a table. For the first time in years, Evelyn didn't shrink. She stepped forward, face unflinching. Playing with a child is not pathetic, but belittling innocence, that is. Silence filled the room, heavy, electric. Maria clutched Elijah closer, eyes glistening. Langford tried one last strike. If you continue like this, the company board will remove you. They'll take everything your husband left you. Evelyn exhaled slowly. If they don't want a CEO with a heart, then they can have my resignation. Langford froze. You wouldn't. I just did. The words echoed, final and freeing. Years of oppression lifted off her shoulders in a single breath. Langford's face turned an ugly shade of red. He grabbed his briefcase, sputtering. You're making a grave mistake, Evelyn. Get out, she said simply. He glared at Elijah on his way out, but the boy didn't hide. He stood straighter, clinging to Evelyn's sleeve, protected. The door slammed behind Langford. Silence filled the dining room again, but this time it wasn't cold. It was warm, alive, a silence made of possibility. Evelyn finally dropped to one knee beside Elijah. Are you all right? He nodded, but tears spilled anyway. I didn't want to get you in trouble. Her heart squeezed. You didn't, you helped me. Maria couldn't hold back her tears. Ma'am, I don't know what to say. Evelyn reached for Elijah's sugar packet villagers and gently brushed the crushed pieces into her hand. We can rebuild the castle, she said softly. Better this time. Elijah wiped his face, sniffling. Really? Really? He threw his arms around her neck, surprising her with the force of his tiny hug. For a moment she froze, unused to being held. Then slowly, hesitantly, she embraced him back. The dining room, once a monument to emptiness, felt full. Not of people, not of wealth, but of something far rarer. Healing. Evelyn looked around the room, imagining what it could become, what it should have been all along. A place where no one ate alone. A place where laughter didn't feel forbidden. A place where a widow found the courage to become more than the ghost she had been living as. Elijah pulled back and whispered, Does this mean I can help build the new castle? Evelyn smiled, really smiled, for the first time in years. It means, she said, brushing his hair gently, this castle belongs to us. The days following the laughter-filled evening were different for the widow. The mansion, once eerily quiet and suffocating with its polished emptiness, began to feel alive. The echoes of the nanny's son's giggles still lingered in the halls, and for the first time in years, she noticed the subtle warmth of sunlight streaming through the tall windows, the soft creak of the wooden floors, and the scent of freshly baked bread that seemed almost to welcome her into life again. She found herself walking into the dining room at unexpected times, curious if she would feel the same heaviness she had carried for decades. But the room now felt like a space of possibility rather than loneliness. The furniture, the silverware, the ornate chandelier, they were no longer symbols of isolation, but tools to facilitate connection. She began to invite her close friends, neighbors, and family to share meals. Each gathering became richer, not because of the extravagant food, but because of the laughter, conversation, and heartfelt interactions that filled the room. More importantly, the widow started to reflect on her own life and her emotional isolation. She remembered why she had shut herself away, fears of vulnerability, disappointment, and the weight of societal expectations. But the little boy's courage had shown her that openness does not mean weakness. Allowing joy, kindness, and spontaneity into her life was not a threat to her dignity. It was a rediscovery of her humanity. She began volunteering at local schools and community centers, inspired by the way a child had quietly transformed her own world. The relationship between the widow and the nanny's son deepened naturally. She became a mentor, a friend, and a guardian figure not out of obligation but out of genuine affection. In return, he continued to teach her the value of curiosity, playfulness, and empathy. Their shared meals became a ritual, a time to laugh, to listen, and to simply be present with one another. The mansion, once a fortress of solitude, had been transformed into a sanctuary of life and warmth. Neighbors noticed the change too. The widow, once seen as cold and distant, became known for her generosity and kindness. Invitations to her home were eagerly accepted, not for the wealth or luxury, but for the joy and laughter that now filled the rooms. The mansion, which had seemed like a monument to loneliness, now radiated life, echoing the sounds of children playing, friends chatting, and the occasional heartfelt conversation that lingered long after guests had left. Yet even with this transformation, the widow remained humble. She knew that her change had not come from wealth or status, but from the simple, genuine connection that had been offered to her by a child unafraid to laugh, speak, and love. It reminded her that life's greatest treasures are intangible: compassion, joy, empathy, and the bonds we form with others. Through these experiences, she learned to cherish both the small moments and the grand gestures, understanding that happiness is not found in possessions or appearances, but in shared human experience. She had been given a second chance, a life where the silence of the past had been replaced by the vibrancy of connection, where the cold elegance of wealth was transformed by the warmth of laughter, and where her heart, long shielded, finally felt at home. By the end of this journey, the widow had truly changed. She had moved from isolation to inclusion, from detachment to involvement, and from emptiness to fulfillment. The mansion itself, now alive with life, stood as a testament to the power of connection, the courage of kindness, and the joy that comes from opening one's heart. Her story became a quiet inspiration to those around her, a reminder that it only takes a single spark, a laugh, a gesture, a child's fearless curiosity, to ignite transformation in even the most secluded heart. The empty dining room was no longer a symbol of loneliness, but of transformation. The rich widow, once trapped in her gilded cage of wealth and isolation, had rediscovered something far more valuable than money: connection, joy, and the warmth of shared laughter. She realized that the world she had built around herself, polished floors, expensive silver, and silent meals, could never replace the human heart she had kept at arm's length. Through the innocent courage of her nanny's son, she learned that kindness does not measure wealth, and that joy can be contagious when given freely. He had walked into her life quietly, yet left a permanent mark, showing that even the smallest gestures of openness could break through walls built over decades. His laughter, his curiosity, his light-hearted teasing had filled the mansion with life, forcing her to confront her own emotional prison. The moral is simple yet profound. Wealth without connection is emptiness. Power without empathy is hollow. And isolation, no matter how luxurious, can never nourish the soul. True richness lies in the hearts we touch, the relationships we nurture, and the laughter we share. As the widow watched her dining room filled with voices, smiles, and the unrestrained joy of a child, she finally understood that the greatest inheritance anyone could leave behind is love, warmth, and human connection. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness and courage can break even the coldest walls. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons come from the least expected teachers, and a single act of openness can transform a life forever. The laughter that once seemed impossible in that empty room now echoed as a promise. Every lonely heart has the potential to be filled with joy if only we let someone in.